Coming up, tribal co-management of public lands is an idea that is gaining traction. Plus, we learn about the complex governance issues facing Alaska Natives. I'm Malia Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from Indian country today.
Arizona PBS is proud to support Indian Country Today. For 6 decades, we've provided television programs and now digital content. But we go beyond that, sending outreach teams across Arizona, offering workshops in language and literacy, family engagement and community outreach, and supporting tribal communities with early learning and school readiness resources. Join us at azpbs.org.
This is Indian Country Today.
Ku'watsi Hopa. Thank you for joining us. I'm Malia Chavez. On the heels of the White House Tribal Nations Summit, Native youth took center stage at the White House Tribal Youth Forum. Native youth met with leaders from the Biden-Harris administration on Wednesday. This included a panel discussion led by Rory Wheeler, a youth advisory board member for the Center for Native American Youth. Nikki Petrie, the executive director for the organization, says the biggest takeaway was the message of belonging.
It was a remark from Secretary Becerra, who told young people you belong in these spaces. So I think an overall takeaway was empowering Native youth and reminding Native youth that they belong in policy, that they belong with the administration, and that they have a space and a voice within the administration.
It was so great to hear that. Just knowing that Native youth have a role to play in the United States government advancing and try to right some of the wrongs. That's what I got from it.
The virtual event was a collaboration between the White House, the Center for Native American Youth, and Nike's N7 program. Among the issues discussed were mental health, food sovereignty, COVID-19, and climate change. Tomorrow, the annual conference for boarding school survivors and descendants kicks off in a virtual forum. The theme is Healing in a Time of Truth and Justice. Christine Dindesy-McCleave is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. She says in this current environment, there is hope for justice. Dindesy-McCleave says with the discovery of mass graves at residential schools in Canada and the call for an investigation of U.S. boarding schools, the truth is coming out. Her organization started the annual conference in 2018, and she says participants have said the best part is being able to talk about their experiences.
So I would say the impacts have definitely been just, creating that space for people to share their stories and to spend time with other boarding school students. We saw that at our second conference in Tulalip as we brought the survivors there together. We always center everything in prayer. And so we open and close each day with a song and a prayer from various tribal nations around the country.
She also recognizes that for some, discussing the issue is sensitive. This year, they will have a separate Zoom room where there will be a certified counselor on hand in case anyone needs help coping. The 2-day event is free, and you can register for it on the website. Dindesy-McCleave says it's a great way for non-natives and researchers to learn firsthand about the government policy on boarding schools. It's well known that American Indians and Alaska Natives face serious health disparities that contribute to high rates of suicide. Now, one program, the Tribal Hub, will be a bridge to culturally responsive services, including suicide prevention and access to behavioral health. Tribal nations and organizations are working with Washington State's Department of Health on new strategies to support positive Indigenous health and to shape suicide prevention campaigns. American Indians and Alaska Natives are twice as likely to die by suicide and 3 times more likely to experience an opioid overdose. Indigenous Americans face these health disparities due to systemic racism and intergenerational trauma, according to the state's Department of Health. The hub will soon launch a dedicated tribal suicide prevention crisis line. It will be staffed by tribal members for tribal community members. The American Indian College Fund and Pendleton Woolen Mills are announcing the 2021 Tribal College Blanket Contest winner. The winner is Chelsea Sear. She calls her design Unity and hopes when people see her design depicting a traditional village, they will get out of their comfort zone and try new things.
I want people to take that step, not be scared, to just go ahead and try new things, because you never know what's gonna be the move to make it, I guess, make a name.
The contest winner says she will be hitting the powwow trail this year with all her newest designs. The first design contest was held in 2020 to highlight students attending tribal colleges and universities. And those are the headlines for Indian Country Today. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Coming up, reimagining federal tribal land management, and we learn about Alaska's unique Indigenous legal landscape. At a time when Indigenous-led conservation is crucial to addressing climate change, conversations are beginning about what co-management of public lands looks like. David Truer, an Ojibwe author and historian, wrote in Atlantic Magazine that management of national parks should be given to tribes. Also writing about the idea of management of public lands is Kevin Washburn. He's the dean of the University of Iowa College of Law and was Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at the Department of Interior in the Obama administration. Dean Washburn has worked to improve federal Indian policy, both from within the federal government and from the outside. In 2015, he was the first high-level federal political official, along with the director of the National Park Service, to visit the land that became the Bears Ears National Monument. Hi, Dean Washburn. Thank you for joining our newscast.
Great to be here today. Thank you.
Tell us on a very broad scale, what does co-management of public lands look like, and what do you envision?
Well, that's a great question, because I think we all have maybe different visions in our minds of what that is. And, what Troyer said was that we should give the national parks back to the tribes, in essence, because they're our most iconic landscapes, and many of them are beloved by tribes. That's one approach, and that wouldn't be co-management. That would be land back, basically, to tribes. But what co-management means, it means something different to different people. And what tribes are interested in is protecting their sacred sites, protecting the wildlife, protecting their ability to do hunting and gathering, from big game to roots and berries to whatever it is. And of course, I said sacred sites. So tribes are interested in a lot of things related to management of public lands. What that looks like could vary dramatically. One, sort of smaller thing that tribes can do is get more involved in the interpretive aspects of national parks, where they come in and they provide better education than is what is currently happening at those parks about the importance of that landscape. So that's not really co-management, but it's a partnership, and so that's relatively modest, but we could work up to tribes actually being contracted to manage these lands, manage all the aspects of the lands, from controlled burns to timber cutting and harvesting to all of the things that happen on these lands. So it varies. I mean, the range of things is extensive. It could involve wildlife management. It could be a whole bunch of different things. So the bottom line is that there are many different ways for tribes to engage in management of federal public lands, and it will vary by tribe. I'm a big believer in tribal self-determination and self-governance, and so it's kind of up to the tribe what they would like to take on in these spaces, and then up to their negotiations with the relevant federal agency, whether it's the National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, whoever the other agency is, as to what they're comfortable with. These have to be partnerships, but there's quite a wide range of what could constitute co-management.
Let's talk about how viable this idea is, given that Congress wouldn't have to give a green light for this idea that you have. Tell us more about that.
Well, this is pursuant to a longstanding program that's been on the books for a long time. And there's actually been a handful of these agreements already between Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM even. There just haven't been very many of them, and they've been very modest. So we don't need action by Congress like we would for a lot of more ambitious tribal co-management arrangements. This one is already authorized, and it would be easy to accomplish.
As you were gathering the research for this and, talking, I suppose, to tribal leaders and federal officials, where did this idea begin for you?
When I was Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs during the Obama administration, tribes came in quite a bit to talk to me about federal public lands that they had an interest in one respect or another, whether it was, sacred places on those lands, whether it was something they were mad about the way things were being run. And as Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs, I oversaw the Bureau of Indian Education, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and some other offices, but I didn't oversee the BLM or the Fish and Wildlife Service. So the best I could do was to get the tribe a meeting with the agency that they wanted to talk to, the Park Service or whoever it was. I didn't have any authority over that. And so it was frustrating to be the assistant secretary and have a big role in Indian affairs, but not really being able to make those things happen. And so really what I realized is those agencies need to come to the table. And what we have now, what's changed since then is we now have a Native American who is the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Holland of Laguna Pueblo, is running the whole shooting match at the Department of the Interior. And so my hope is that the agencies will be interested in doing things that I think are consistent with her vision. And I suspect her vision includes a greater role for Indigenous people in the United States and Native American tribal nations. And so that's kind of where the idea came from. And I think the idea is ripe at this moment. We have such leadership in the Department of the Interior right now for Indigenous people.
You bring up a really great point, and I want to actually hone in on that a little bit more. For tribes who want to co-manage public lands, do you think that there is a real possibility that it could happen under Secretary Holland's tenure? And to add a layer to that, what is the pushback that you would expect to see?
Well, yes, let me say first, yes, I think the times are changing. I think that tribes they've asserted themselves for the last 50 years in a really strong way. They have undertaken lots of contracts with the federal government. So most of the work of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education and the Indian Health Service these days is done by tribes. More than half of the work of those agencies has been contracted to tribes to run. So, and when that happens, the tribe gets the resources and provides the services, but it's a federal responsibility that they're meeting, often treaty responsibilities. So tribes have really increased their ability to run federal contracts, and they get scrutinized. They have to do audits and go through all the scrutiny that happens with federal contractors. It's a little bit different in the Native American context, but in essence, they are federal contractors and they get a lot of the same scrutiny. So point one, tribes are much more capable these days. They're accustomed to doing these sorts of things and working with federal agencies. Point number two, I think that the United States is reckoning more than it ever has in the past with broken promises and the really bad circumstances that have led to poverty and problems on Indian reservations. We've had 230 years of really bad federal policy, and I shouldn't say 230 years, the last 50 years have been much better. But I feel like at this moment in history, there's a real effort by the United States to reckon with the problems that we've seen. And this is one way to do that, recognizing this partnership and this co-stewardship that could be happening. So that's one of the real changes. I think now the time is right, and it's partially because of the leadership that we have at the with the Secretary of the Interior, the leadership that we have in the Biden administration generally, but also just a time of historical change. I think that younger generations are interested in righting some of the wrongs of the past, and I think that the United States is moving towards a place where it's ready to do some of those things, and this is a small way to start to right some of those wrongs.
Another big initiative of the younger generation, of course, is climate change. How does this idea play into protecting sacred sites and, of course, making sure that Indigenous people are doing their part to address climate change?
Well, that's a great question and a great point. The Biden administration has really made climate change a central focus of its efforts. Number one focus, of course, is dealing with COVID-19. But climate change is such a serious problem, and the Biden administration is committed to dealing with it. One of the ways they've committed to dealing with it is through this 30 by 30 program, which is to conserve 30% of American land by 2030. That's a very ambitious goal to protect that much land, really, and we only have nine years or less than 9 years now to do that. And so if the Biden administration wants to accomplish that, it really needs tribes as partners. And tribes have long been interested in good stewardship of lands, obviously. They did it well for centuries and centuries before the United States ever came along. And they've got deep experience in doing that, obviously, as well. So I think that tribes are as interested as anybody in addressing the climate change problem. And this is a way for them to partner. One of the things to keep in mind is tribes are, in many respects, the most vulnerable communities in the United States to climate change, because they are in the coldest places and the hottest places. And those extremes are going to get worse with climate change. So tribes are, they've always been interested in good stewardship, and they're very motivated to help with climate change. And this is a tangible way for tribes to be part of the 30 by 30 initiative and other initiatives to protect land and address climate change.
Before we end, I want to talk about implementation of this idea of co-management of public lands. We're starting with this idea now. How does this realistically go and be implemented?
Well, this isn't very interesting, but basically it just involves a lot of on-the-ground conversations, park superintendents talking to their neighboring tribes, regional directors at the Department of the Interior and the Forest Service kind of reaching out and doing tribal consultations, bringing a bunch of tribes together and say, hey, who has a project they're interested in working with us on? It's really, it's the leadership at the secretarial level at Interior and Agriculture need to set the tone, but it really just involves a lot of conversations. And what I've called on Department of Interior and the Department of Agriculture to do is to host some tribal consultations where this is the subject, and that tribes that are interested in this sort of thing can come and see what they're interested in doing, and see if some conversations can develop and some partnerships can develop. The Department of the Interior publishes a list annually of the properties, the park units and the wildlife refuges where this can happen. And they also publish a list of the activities that tribes could potentially contract for. Those conversations just need to start. And that's the way to make it, make it happen, make it implement itself. And it won't happen quickly, but it takes, 6 months, a year of negotiations sometimes to make these things happen. But those conversations need to start. And I think we will see that.
Well, Kevin Washburn, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Coming up, Alaska Natives face complex governance challenges. We'll be right back. Alaska's indigenous legal landscape is unique when compared to the rest of the lower 48. There are Alaska Native regional and village corporations, which oversee around 44 million acres of indigenous land. And then there are 231 federally recognized Alaska Native tribes, which have a government-to-government relationship with the United States. And they have one Indian reservation. ICT's Megan Sullivan has been working on a series of special reports for the 50th anniversary of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in partnership with Solutions Journalism and the Alaska Center for Excellence in Journalism. You can read her stories at IndianCountryToday.com and search Alaska Without Angsa, Look to Metlakatla, and Being Good Relatives. Hi, Megan. Thanks for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Tell us about the Metlakatla Indian community.
Yeah, so it's the only federal reserve in Alaska. And basically, 50 years ago, when the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was being passed, they had the choice to keep their reserve status or to join ANCSA. And there were actually a few other reservations in the state at the time, and they all decided to choose ANCSA in the end. And it's really interesting dynamic today because there's a lot of similarities between Metlakatla and the surrounding southeast villages, but the big difference is in kind of their governance structure and their management. So Metlakatla oversees and manages their own lands, their own waters. This relates to hunting, fishing, also their own justice system, whereas the rest of the communities, for the most part, in Alaska, have to go through the state government. And that causes problems with subsistence. It just kind of creates different challenges, I think. And, the people in Metlakatla have said that they actually feel more similar to Northwest tribes in the lower 48. And they're actually part of that department in the BIA instead of the Alaska department. So you see those differences really play out in some interesting ways.
And what does that look like when the Metlakatla Indian community is in conversation with other Alaska Native villages and tribes? Because I'm guessing that they're not a part of the same corporations and regional corporations, what does that look like in terms of their relationship with other tribes in Alaska?
Yeah, so the people I interviewed said that back in the day, kind of before ANCSA, Metlakatla used to have a larger seat at the table among other Alaska Native communities. And today, when they go to the Alaska Federation of Natives or other kind of gatherings with the communities, they're happy to see everyone and whatnot, but they have trouble relating to kind of the topics everyone's talking about because just the situations and the obstacles and the current present day dynamics are so different. So there's a little bit of a distance there. They're kind of off in their own own world almost. They have a completely different management system. And that definitely shows up, I think, when they're kind of relating to the rest of the community at these large events.
There's a phrase that an Inupiaq elder, Vernita Herdman, likes to say, and she says, when natives fight natives, someone else is winning. What are the issues that the Metlakatla Indian community faces versus other tribes?
Yeah, so I think, when it comes to that quote and kind of the differences between the tribes and the corporations, it really differs region by region. And you sometimes see this tension coming towards resource development specifically. So in the past, this has been about, building a road or logging, and a tribe might be against it, why the regional or village corporation might support it. It gets a little complicated because these two entities are serving the same Alaska Native communities. They're made up by the same people, tribal citizens, and the shareholders are the same people. Sometimes even the leadership can be the same, and yet there's still this kind of conflict. And so, and sometimes there's not even a huge conflict. It's just the communication or the coordination hasn't been great between the two. So there's a few new initiatives in the state that are kind of working to build bridges between the two entities and to kind of overcome this conflict that has sometimes appeared in the past. And that's where that quote comes from, a really great quote from Vernita that kind of outlines the goal of these different programs to bridge those differences and, get rid of conflict where there doesn't need to be conflict.
You talked to a number of sources for this story specifically. If you had to summarize, what is the biggest takeaway that you want people to know?
I think for the Metlakatla story, I think the biggest takeaway I have is that even within Alaska, there needs to be more kind of education or communication about how these different policies affect our communities, because a lot of people within the state aren't even aware of the details of Metlakatla. They don't know the history. They don't know they had a choice to join ANCSA. They're not sure how this would even show up. Like how the reservation status they have makes their governance different. And those are the comments I've been getting from readers here in Anchorage. So I think, there needs to be more communication, I guess, across the board about how these policies affect our communities.
And I could also see how that's important for tribes in the lower 48 as well. Megan Sullivan, thank you so much.
Thanks.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news and updates, visit us anytime at IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Malia Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
This is Indian Country Today.